The air at the Hemlock Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of July humidity, diesel fumes, and the sweet, sad smell of decay. It was the scent of a life's work being scattered to the four winds. I stood in the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, watching the vultures circle. Not real vultures, of course, but men in clean chore coats and seed corn hats, their checkbooks ready. They picked over the bones of Earl Hemlock's 60 years of toil, bidding up his John Deere 4020, his New Holland baler, his grain wagons, all the tools of a life spent, wrestling a living from the black Iowa soil. Leading the pack was Richard Sterling. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was a phenomenon, a storm front rolling across the county. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing on his lips. His banker, a pale man named Henderson in a tight suit, hovering at his elbow like a pilot fish. Sterling had bought the 80 acres adjoining my place last spring and was already farming it like he was trying to erase the fence rows from the map. He'd just taken delivery of a brand new International in 66, a beast of a tractor with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a radio that probably got stations all the way from Des Moines. He was the future, and he made sure everyone knew it. I was just trying to hold on to the past. Dad had died the winter before, leaving me the 160 acres he and his father had scraped together, free and clear. His final words to me, his breath smelling of coffee and wintergreen, were, "Don't ever let the bank own you, Jack. Own no man. That's the only freedom there is." I was trying to honor that, farming with his old 4010 and a collection of tired but functional equipment. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained gavel, was winding down. Most of the good stuff was gone, loaded onto trailers behind shiny new Ford and Chevy pickups. Sterling had bought the 4020, even though he didn't need it, just to have a spare. He'd paid top dollar, a move meant to show everyone how much cash was flowing. "All right, folks, one last item," the auctioneer squawked, pointing toward the overgrown windbreak at the edge of the farmstead. Sitting right where Earl parked it, 20 years ago, we got an international harvester, Farmall M. What am I bid for this piece of history? A collective chuckle rippled through the remaining crowd. The M was a ghost. It sat canted to one side, its rear tire rotted off the rim and sunk halfway into the earth. Rust wasn't just on it, it was holding it together. A thicket of wild raspberry canes grew up through the engine compartment, and a bird's nest was tucked under the steering wheel. It was junk, plain and simple. "Who'll give me $20? The auctioneer pleaded. Silence. $10? $5? Come on, boys, the scrap man will give you more than that. Sterling let out a loud, braying laugh. You'd have to pay the scrap man to haul that anchor away. Something stirred in me. Maybe it was the way he dismissed it. Maybe it was the memory of my Grandpa Callahan talking about his old M, the tractor that built our farm after the war. It had good bones, as he used to say, strong cast iron, a simple design. $50, I said. My voice sounded louder than I intended in the quiet afternoon. Every head turned to look at me. Sterling's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of disbelief. He nudged his banker. "Hear that, Henderson? Callahan's buying himself a new planter weight." The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $50 from the young Mr. Callahan. I got 50. Do I hear 60? $50 once. $50 twice. Sold for $50 to the man with more time than sense. The gavel cracked, and the Farmall M was mine. After I paid the clerk my two $20 bills and a 10, I walked over to my prize. It was worse up close. The engine was seized solid. I could tell just by looking at the rust, fused between the cylinder head and the block. The radiator was shot, the tinwork was dented and torn, and the wiring was a chewed-up mess of insulation and bare copper. Sterling sauntered over, kicking at the one good front tire. "So, what's the plan, Callahan? You gonna plow with that thing, or just let it rust in a different spot on your farm?" I ran my hand over the pitted, sun-bleached hood. "It's got good bones," I said, echoing my grandfather's words. He laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "Bones are for boneyards. That thing is a relic." "This," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the highway where his new 1066 was probably sitting, "is how you farm today. Power, speed, credit. You're trying to fight a war with a musket, son. You'll be broke in 2 years trying to farm with junk like that." He turned and walked away, his banker scurrying to keep up. I stood there for a long time, the jeers of the crowd fading as they drove away, leaving me alone with my $50 mistake. Doubt, cold and heavy, settled in my gut. He was right. It was a fool's errand. The amount of work it would take was staggering. The cost of parts, even used ones, would add up. I could be spending that time rebuilding fences or tuning up the 40-10. I hooked a chain from my pickup to the tractor's front axle, and, with a groan of tortured metal and the shriek of a wheel locked solid for 2 decades, I dragged the Farmall M out of its grave and down the 2 miles of gravel road to my farm. I left it sitting in the yard, between the barn and the machine shed, an ugly monument to my own stubborn pride. For a week, I just looked at it. Every time I walked past, it seemed to mock me. Sterling's words echoed in my head. Broke in 2 years. Was he right? Was my father's advice outdated? Was I just a fool, clinging to a past that couldn't compete with the present? The whole county was borrowing money, expanding, buying new. I was trying to go backward, to resurrect a corpse. Now, before we get the wrenches turning on this thing, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, told you was a lost cause? A car, a machine, a business, maybe even a relationship, something that every sensible person said to walk away from? Let me know down in the comments, because standing there in the setting sun, looking at that heap of red rust, Jack Callahan was at the very beginning of that long, lonely road. The first step was pressure washing. It took 2 full days to blast away 20 years of caked-on grease, dirt, and bird droppings. Underneath the grime, the situation looked even more grim. The sheet metal was as thin as paper in spots, and the rust had eaten clean through the bottom of the fuel tank. But the main frame, the transmission housing, the final drives, the heavy cast-iron heart of the machine, was solid. The bones were indeed good. I decided to start with the engine. If I couldn't make it run, the rest was pointless. Getting it out was a fight. Every bolt was a battle. I soaked them for days in penetrating oil, a concoction of acetone and transmission fluid my dad had sworn by. Even then, most of them wouldn't budge. I put a 4-foot cheetah pipe on my biggest breaker bar and pulled until I saw stars, my muscles screaming in protest. More than one bolt head sheared off with a sickening crack, which meant hours of careful drilling and using an extractor bit. Finally, with the help of a chain hoist slung over a thick oak limb, I lifted the greasy, 300-pound engine block out of the frame and swung it onto a heavy-duty engine stand in my workshop. The shop was my sanctuary. It smelled of motor oil, cold steel, and damp earth. It was where my father had taught me how to weld, how to time an engine, how to read the language of a machine through sound and feel. His tools hung on the walls, clean and organized, their wooden handles dark with the sweat of his hands. In here, I felt close to him. I felt like I was doing something he would have understood. Pulling the cylinder head was the moment of truth. After breaking 3 sockets and skinning every knuckle on my right hand, the last head bolt gave way with a groan. I lifted the heavy cast-iron head off. What I saw underneath made my heart sink. It was a swamp of rust-colored water and sludge. The pistons were fused to the cylinder walls, locked in a permanent embrace of corrosion. I tried turning the crankshaft with a long bar. It didn't move a millimeter. Seized solid. Anyone else would have sent the block to the scrapyard right then. But I was in too deep. My pride wouldn't let me quit. I remembered an old trick my grandpa used. I poured a quart of Marvel mystery oil into the cylinders, followed by a can of diesel fuel, hoping the mixture would slowly creep down past the piston rings and break the bond of rust. I let it sit for a week, tapping on the tops of the pistons with a wooden block and a hammer every day. While I waited for the oil to work its magic, word of Jack's folly spread through the county. When I went to the co-op for a hydraulic hose for my planter, a couple of the old-timers at the coffee counter started in on me. "Heard you're starting a museum, Jack," one of them, a farmer named Miller, said with a grin. "Gonna charge admission?" "Just trying to save a piece of history," I mumbled, my face turning red. Rich Sterling was there, of course, holding court by the parts counter. He'd just traded his year-old disc for a brand-new 24-foot international model with hydraulic folding wings. "History belongs in books, Callahan," he boomed, making sure everyone could hear. "Progress is what pays the bills. I'll have my 400 acres of corn in the ground in 3 days. How long you figure it'll take you with that 40-10 and your new lawn ornament?" The laughter stung more than the skinned knuckles. I grabbed my hose and left, the sound of their chuckles following me out the door. Even Sarah, my girlfriend, who worked as a waitress at the town diner, was starting to have her doubts. "Jack, honey," she said one night as she slid a plate of meatloaf in front of me. "Mr. Sterling was in here today, talking about the price of land going up. He said you could borrow against your farm and buy the old Miller place. He said you're sitting on a gold mine and not digging." "Sterling doesn't know anything about my farm," I said, more sharply than I intended. "And my father didn't believe in debt." "Your father also farmed with horses for 10 years, Jack," she said softly. "Times change." Her words hit a nerve because I was afraid she was right. I went back to the shop that night, feeling the weight of the whole world on my shoulders. I decided to try and force the pistons out. I built a makeshift press using a 20-ton bottle jack and some scrap I-beam, positioning it over the engine block. I placed a steel plate over the first piston and started pumping at the jack. The frame creaked and groaned. The pressure built until the I-beam started to flex. I was sure something was going to shatter. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the piston broke free, moving a fraction of an inch. One by one, over 2 long, sweaty nights, I forced all 4 pistons out of the block. They were a sorry sight. The rings rusted into the grooves, the skirts scored and pitted. 2 of the cylinder sleeves, the replaceable liners the pistons travel in, had cracked under the strain. The block would have to go to a machine shop to have new sleeves pressed in. It was another expense, another delay. Dejected, I started cleaning the block for the trip to town. I scraped the thick, tar-like sludge from the bottom of the oil pan. My scraper hit something hard that wasn't supposed to be there. I dug it out with my fingers. It wasn't a broken piece of metal. It was a small, rectangular brass tag, about the size of my thumb, blackened with age. It was attached to one of the oil pan bolts on the inside. I cleaned it with a rag. Stamped into the brass were a series of numbers and letters. EXPHTX41. It wasn't a standard International Harvester part number. I knew that much. It looked more like something from a prototype shop. I puzzled over it for a minute, then tossed it into the coffee can where I kept stray nuts and bolts and forgot about it. My main concern was the cracked sleeves and the growing feeling that I was wasting my time, that Sterling and everyone else was right. The year turned to 1973, and the world changed. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly negotiated a deal to buy nearly a quarter of the United States' wheat crop. The news broke like a thunderclap across the farm belt. Commodity prices, which had been stable for years, went absolutely insane. Corn, which had been trading at $1.50 a bushel, shot past $2, then $2.50, then $3. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, told us to tear out our fence rows and plant fence row to fence row. A wave of wild, intoxicating optimism swept through the heartland. It felt like the good times would never end. For men like Rich Sterling, it was like winning the lottery. He was perfectly positioned to capitalize on the boom. With his big, new equipment, he worked around the clock, planting every square inch of his ground. The money was rolling in so fast he couldn't count it. He used his new windfall as a down payment to buy the 120-acre Miller place, taking out another huge loan from Henderson at the Farmers' Trust. The interest rate was only 6%. It seemed like free money. Land prices were exploding, jumping 20% in a single year. Sterling was no longer just a farmer. He was hailed as a visionary, a businessman of the highest order. He traded his Ford pickup for a new Lincoln Continental, a land yacht the color of champagne. He was the king of the county, and he never missed an opportunity to remind me of it. I saw him one afternoon at the diner. He strode in, flashing a diamond pinky ring and a Rolex watch. He saw me sitting in a booth with Sarah. "Still playing with that old red relic, Callahan?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I just cleared more profit this month than your whole farm is worth. You're missing the boat, kid. A tidal wave of cash is rolling in, and you're sitting on the beach playing with toys." Sarah looked down at her hands, a faint blush on her cheeks. I just nodded and kept eating my sandwich. But his words found their mark. I had a good year, too. My 160 acres, all paid for, produced a bumper crop of corn that I sold for a price I never dreamed possible. I suddenly had a pile of cash in my checking account. The smart move, the Sterling move, would have been to leverage it, to use it to expand. The bank manager, Henderson, called me into his office. "Jack," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "you're in an enviable position. No debt. Significant equity. Land values are climbing every day. You're letting that equity sit idle. Let's put it to work. We can get you into a new tractor, a bigger planter, and there's 80 acres coming up for sale just north of you." I listened politely, but my father's voice was louder in my head. "Oh no, man." I took my profits, paid off my small operating note for seed and fertilizer, and put the rest into a passbook savings account at that very same bank. It was earning a measly 4% interest. Henderson looked at me like I had two heads. In an economy where inflation was starting to tick upwards past 6, 7, 8%, I was actively losing money. I was seen as a fool, a timid throwback who didn't understand modern finance. Even Sarah couldn't hide her disappointment. "Jack, are you sure?" she asked. "Everyone is getting ahead. We could have a new house." I didn't have a good answer for her, other than a gut feeling, a deep-seated caution that had been bred into me. While Sterling was buying land and iron, I was spending my evenings in the shop, hunched over the engine of the Farmall M. I had gotten the block back from the machine shop in Des Moines, the new sleeves pressed in and honed to a perfect finish. I spent weeks meticulously reassembling it. I plastic-arged the new bearings, torqued the connecting rods to spec with a precision torque wrench, and carefully set the ring gap on the new pistons. It was slow, painstaking work. I cleaned every part, painted the block a gleaming IH red, and reinstalled it in the tractor frame. I rebuilt the carburetor, put in a new clutch, and ran new wiring. I found a used radiator at a salvage yard and soldered its leaks myself. I hammered out the dents in the hood and grille and gave the whole machine a fresh coat of paint and new decals. By the time I was done, it looked like it had just rolled off the factory floor in 1951. The real work, the heart of it, was hidden inside. One cool evening in the fall of '74, it was finally ready. I checked the oil, filled the radiator with coolant, and put 5 gallons of gasoline in the freshly sealed tank. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was the culmination of more than a year of work, of ridicule, of skinned knuckles and lonely nights. I pulled the choke, turned the key, and hit the starter button. The engine turned over, slow and sluggish at first. It coughed once, spitting a puff of black smoke from the exhaust stack. It sputtered, caught for a second, then died. I adjusted the carburetor, gave it a little less choke, and tried again. This time it fired, and it stayed running. But the sound was all wrong. A stock Farmall M has a lazy, rhythmic put, put, put at idle, a sound as familiar in the Midwest as a crow's call. This was different. It had a deeper, throatier rumble, a menacing growl that vibrated through the concrete floor of the shop. When I cracked the throttle, it didn't just gain RPMs. It snapped to attention with a sharp, crisp bark, a crackle that sounded more like a hot rod than a farm tractor. It ran smoother, faster, and with a ferocity that no M had any right to possess. I was baffled, but also thrilled. All my work had paid off, and then some. The following spring, I put it to the test. I hooked it up to my old 4-bottom plough, a load that would have made a standard M grunt and struggle, especially in our heavy clay soil. The restored Farmall didn't even seem to notice it was there. It pulled the plough through the field with an authority that was shocking, the engine humming a deep, powerful tune, never once lugging down. And I noticed something else. It was barely using any fuel. It was far more efficient than it should have been. I felt a surge of pride that I hadn't felt in a long, long time. I had done it. I had taken a piece of junk and turned it into a machine that was better, stronger than the original. As I worked my fields that spring, I'd often see Sterling on the horizon. He had traded up again, this time to a massive articulated Steiger 4-wheel drive, a true monster of the modern age, pulling a 12-bottom plough. He could do in an hour what took me half a day. He was the symbol of the boom, of progress, of the new religion of debt and expansion. But in the evenings, when I'd shut down the strange, powerful Farmall in my barn, the radio on my workbench would crackle with troubling news. Stories from far away about an oil embargo in the Middle East, gas lines in the cities, talk of inflation getting out of control, and whispers from Washington that the Federal Reserve, the new chairman, Paul Volcker, was considering a drastic, painful cure, jacking up interest rates to break inflation's back. I'd wipe the grease from my hands and look out at my small, paid-for fields, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. It was a feeling that had nothing to do with the mysterious, powerful engine humming in my barn, and everything to do with the storm clouds I could see gathering on the economic horizon, clouds that men like Rich Sterling, flying high on the wings of cheap credit, couldn't or wouldn't see. The boom years ended not with a bang, but with the slow, agonizing hiss of air leaking from a tire. It began subtly in the late 1970s. The price of diesel fuel which had been 30 cents a gallon when I started farming, crept past $1, then $1.20. A 55-gallon drum was no longer a casual expense. Nitrogen fertilizer, its production tied directly to the price of natural gas, tripled in cost. The numbers on the expense side of my ledger began to swell, eating away at the profits from the still decent grain prices. For men like Rich Sterling, these were not subtle hints. They were body blows. His massive Steiger four-wheel drive, the pride of his fleet, drank 50 gallons of diesel in a hard afternoon's work. His input costs for his 1,000 acres were astronomical. The river of cash that had been flowing his way slowed to a trickle, then to a muddy drip. But the river of debt he owed the bank flowed on, constant and unforgiving. The first real crack in his empire appeared during corn planting in the spring of '79. I was in my north field, the one that bordered his land, pulling my 6-row planter with the John Deere 4010. The Farmall M, with its strange, powerful engine, had become my primary tillage tractor. It was so efficient on fuel that I used it for all the heavy work, ploughing, disking, chiseling. Across the fence line, Sterling's Steiger sat silent in the middle of a half-planted field. It had been sitting there for 3 days. I saw him out there, kicking at one of the huge tires, his posture radiating a helpless fury. I shut down the 4010 and walked over. "Trouble?" I asked. He barely looked at me. His face was pale and drawn, the confident smirk I remembered, now just a tight, bitter line. "Hydraulic pump went out," he grunted. "Took the dealer 2 days to figure it out. Now they tell me the part is on back order from the factory in North Dakota. Might be another week." "A week?" He gestured wildly at the sky, at the perfect, cloudless blue. "This is planting weather, Callahan. A man loses yield every day he's not in the ground after the 10th of May. I'm losing thousands just sitting here." "Can't you use your 1066? I asked. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "The 1066 is in the dealer's shop, too. Transmission problem. They want $4,000 to fix it. $4,000. And the planter I've got hooked to this green monster is too big for the 1066 anyway. Everything is tied to everything else. When one piece breaks, the whole damn system grinds to a halt." He looked at my 4010, chugging away patiently at the end of the field, and then at the Farmall MI had parked by my barn. There was no mockery in his eyes now, only a weary, hollowed-out look that I had never seen before. You can fix your own stuff, can't you?" "Most of it," I said. "Parts are easy to find, simple to work on." He just shook his head and stared out at his half-planted field, a general watching his army get bogged down in the mud. I left him there and went back to my own work, the steady rhythm of my old equipment a comforting counterpoint to the brittle silence from his side of the fence. The whispers about Sterling's troubles grew louder at the co-op and the diner. He was late paying his fuel bill. He'd had to sell a load of beans at a loss to make a payment at the bank. The Lincoln Continental was gone, replaced by a dusty, 10-year-old Ford sedan. The interest rates on his loans, which had been a manageable 8%, were now ticking up past 12, then 15%. The Federal Reserve, under its new chairman, was waging an all-out war on inflation, and farmers with variable-rate loans were the front-line casualties. My own curiosity about the M's peculiar engine had become a quiet obsession. In the winter months, I started digging. I wrote a letter to the International Harvester Archives Department in Chicago, describing the engine's performance, and including a rubbing of the strange brass tag I'd found in the oil pan. Then I heard about a man named Gus Mueller, a retired IH mechanic who lived 2 counties over. They said he'd forgotten more about red tractors than most men ever knew. I found him in a cavernous machine, shed filled with the ghosts of tractors past. He was a small, wiry man in his 80s, with hands permanently stained black from a lifetime of grease. I told him my story and showed him the brass tag. He held it up to the light, turning it over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration. He squinted at the stamped letters, XPHTX41. "Well, I'll be," he rasped, his voice gravelly with age. "I haven't seen one of these in 50 years. Not since I was a young fella, working a summer at the proving grounds in Hinsdale." "What is it?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "Experimental," he said, tapping the tag. "That's what EXP means. Back after the war, all the companies were playing with new engine designs. High compression, different fuel mixes, weird-shaped combustion chambers. They were trying to squeeze more power out of less fuel. This HT," he paused, rubbing his chin. "I remember some of the engineers talking about a high turbulence. Had supposed to mix the air and fuel better. Got you a more complete burn. More bang for your buck." He handed the tag back to me. "They built a handful of these prototypes, tested 'em, ran 'em till they broke, then cut 'em up for scrap. That was the rule. None were ever supposed to leave the proving grounds. Looks like one got away." He looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his wrinkled face. "Son, you ain't just got an old tractor there. You got a unicorn." The crisis, when it finally broke, was a tsunami. In 1981, the prime interest rate hit 21.5%. It was an economic neutron bomb. It killed the inflation, but it also vaporized the equity and cash flow of an entire generation of farmers. Land that Sterling had paid $3,000 an acre for was now worth maybe $1,200, but his loans were still for $3,000. The math was inescapable and brutal. Every trip into town was a fresh heartbreak. The bulletin board at the post office became a wall of sorrows, plastered with notices of farm auctions. Good men, hard-working men I had known my entire life, were being wiped out. Their names and the legal descriptions of their land were printed in stark black ink for the whole world to see. One Tuesday morning, I saw the notice. Under the seal of the Farmers' Trust Bank, there it was. Public auction. The property of Richard and Carol Sterling. It listed it all. The home quarter section, the Miller place, the 80 acres next to me, a full line of equipment. Everything. An entire life's ambition, summarized on an 8x11 sheet of paper held up by a thumbtack. I drove out to his place. The yard, once immaculately mowed, was overgrown with weeds. The paint was peeling on the big white house he'd been so proud of. The massive machine shed, his cathedral of progress, stood with its doors agape, revealing the dark, silent shapes of machinery he could no longer afford to fuel or fix. I found him in his workshop, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at nothing. He looked 10 years older than he had the last time I'd seen him. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dull, defeated ash. "I saw the notice," I said quietly. He didn't look up. "Henderson was just here. The banker," he said, his voice a monotone, "used to come out here and clap me on the back, call me a genius. Today he wouldn't even look me in the eye. Just handed me the papers." He finally raised his head, and the despair in his eyes was a physical thing. "I did everything they told me to do, Callahan. I followed all the advice. Get big or get out. Leverage your assets. Farm Fensero to Fensero. It was all a lie, a goddamn trap." "It's not your fault, Rich," I said. "The whole world got turned upside down." "It is my fault," he shot back, a flicker of the old anger returning. "I was arrogant. I laughed at you. I laughed at your father's way of thinking. I called you a fool." He slumped back down. "Turns out I was the fool all along. Your dad was right. The bank owns me. They own my house, my land, my machines. They even own my future. I have nothing. I left him there, the silence in that workshop heavier than any machine. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. It was on official letterhead from the historical archives of Navistar International, the company that had emerged from the old International Harvester. The letter, written by a corporate historian, confirmed everything Gus Muller had told me, and more. The engine in my Farmall M was one of only 3 HTX series prototypes ever built. It featured a unique cross-flow cylinder head with specially shaped intake ports to induce extreme mixture turbulence, combined with an unheard-of for the era 8.5.1 compression ratio. It was designed to run on a variety of fuels and produced nearly 60 horsepower on the dynamometer, a full 20 horsepower over a stock M. While using 30% less fuel, the project was shelved in 1952 due to high manufacturing costs and the cheap fuel of the time. The other 2 prototypes had been documented as destroyed. Mine was the sole survivor. The historian finished the letter by saying that the company and several private collectors would be extremely interested in acquiring such a historically significant machine, and that its value was inestimable. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. The news, which should have made me feel ecstatic, just made me feel quiet. The fortune wasn't in the tractor. The fortune was in the lesson it represented. The day of Sterling's auction was cold and grey, a November sky the colour of lead. The crowd was huge, but subdued. There was no festive chatter, no opportunistic buzz like there had been at the Hemlock sale. These were neighbours and friends, gathered to watch a man's life be dismantled piece by piece. They stood in grim, silent clusters, their faces etched with the knowledge that it could just as easily be their farm on the auction block next month. Sterling and his wife Carol stood on the porch of their house, looking like strangers at their own funeral. Henderson the banker stood beside the auctioneer, his face a mask of professional detachment. The auctioneer cleared his throat and was about to start on the first parcel of land, Sterling's home, 160 acres. "Wait," I said. My voice cut through the quiet. Every head turned toward me. I walked through the crowd, past the curious and pitying stares, until I was standing in front of Sterling and Henderson. "Henderson," I said, my voice steady, "I want to make an offer for the home quarter, before the auction." The banker looked surprised. "Jack, the bidding is the only fair way." "My offer isn't just for me," I interrupted. I turned to Sterling. "Rich, I'll take over the note on this quarter section. I've got enough in savings for a down payment to satisfy the bank's requirements, and we can restructure the loan at today's land values at a payment I can make. But it comes with a condition." Sterling stared at me, his eyes blank with confusion. "What condition?" "The condition is, you and Carol keep living in the house, and you come work for me, for a wage. We'll farm my land and this land together. You know the new ways, the business side of things I never learned. I know the old iron, how to keep things running when money's tight. We'll work together. And when things get better, when we're back on our feet, we'll have the lawyers draw up an agreement that lets you earn a share back. We'll be partners." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Henderson looked completely stunned. Sterling just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. I saw his eyes glisten, and he looked away, toward the fields he was about to lose forever. "Why?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, after how I treated you, why would you do this?" I thought of my father's words. "Owe no man." He was right about debt, but I realized in that moment that the words meant more than just money. You shouldn't let pride or bitterness own you, either. Because this whole thing is wrong, I said, my voice rising so the whole crowd could hear. We're letting them pick us off one by one. This isn't about who's smart and who's a fool. It's about a community, and you're a part of it. Your father and my father farmed this ground side by side. That's got to mean something. I stuck out my hand. For a long moment, he just looked at it. Then, slowly, he raised his own and took it. His grip was firm. It was the grip of a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. We worked it out with the bank. The rest of Sterling's land was sold off, but we saved the home place. And just as I promised, we started over, together. It was hard. The 80s were lean years for everyone. But we made it work. Rich, humbled, and stripped of his arrogance, was the best partner a man could ask for. He taught me how to hedge my crops and watch the markets. I taught him how to rebuild a carburetor and weld a broken spindle. We combined his knowledge with my caution, and slowly, carefully, we began to prosper. Sarah and I were married in the little country church a year later. Rich was my best man. Years passed. The seasons turned. The farm crisis faded into a painful memory. Sarah and I had a son. We named him Thomas, after my grandfather. Rich and Carol became like an uncle and aunt to him. Our two farms, his old one and my father's, were run as one. One Saturday afternoon, when Tom was about 15, I found him in the machine shed, standing in front of the old Farmall M. I kept it parked in the corner, clean and polished, a monument to a different time. I only took it out for parades and tractor shows now. "Dad," he said, running his hand over the gleaming red hood. "Uncle Rich told me this tractor saved the farm. Is that true?" I leaned against the big rear tire, the rubber still solid after all these years. "In a way," I said. "But it wasn't the tractor itself, Tom. It was the lesson it taught me." I told him everything. About the auction where I bought it for $50, about the ridicule, the seized engine, and the long nights in the shop. I told him about the grain boom and the temptation to borrow and expand. I told him about the mysterious brass tag and the secret hidden inside its engine. And I told him about Sterling's auction and the choice I had to make that day. "This tractor," I said, patting the fuel tank, "is special. It's a one-of-a-kind piece of history. But the most valuable thing about it isn't the metal. It's the idea. Your great-grandfather told me to never let the bank own me. He was right. You have to own your work, own your decisions. You can't let debt or pride or what other people think be your master. That's the only real freedom there is." Tom looked from the tractor to me, his eyes full of understanding. He was listening, really listening. I knew in that moment that the lesson was safe, that it had been passed on. The real fortune wasn't the rare engine that could have made me rich. It was the simple, sturdy wisdom that had been passed from my grandfather to my father, to me. And now, to my son. Standing there in the quiet of the machine shed, with the smell of old iron and good earth all around us, I knew that was a legacy worth more than all the land in Iowa.